Dr. Starkey, I will just so quickly mention how much we've enjoyed each of your programs and move straight on to the question, which is, to start off with, thank you so much for your wisdom. How would you approach gradual change and what you would, I mean, you used a different phraseology, but gradual change, because some of it is necessary. When you were mentioning that the human rights is liberal, in a way, sometimes the Conservative Party take a fundamentally good idea, run in front of the race and say, oh, look, that was our idea. Like the Human Rights Act, and sometimes you hear the Conservative members saying, oh, well, we're going to scrap that if we leave, but we'll rehash it. But my question was, sometimes it is necessary. Yep. Like an old Persian emperor was so successful in Persepolis that the palace didn't have doors, and he just ruled in peace. And there's that famous rock that I think is in New York, but the replica is in the British Museum, the first example of the human rights, and it says no slavery, treat animals well. Sometimes it is necessary, and it can have a relationship with power, and it isn't all liberalism and somebody nonchalantly saying transgender toilets and using that example in an offensive way. How would you marry the two together then?
I get the point. You see, it seems to me to be entirely sensible that an absolute emperor will emit statements like all men are equal and whatever, because this again is nonsense on stilts. What we should be doing, this is one of the reasons why the Remainer movement has had the power that it has amongst younger people. They've somehow got the notion that we get our rights and our liberties from Europe. This is preposterous. This is absurd. This is ridiculous. Europe, is a rather poor parody of what England has been for the last 700 or 800 years. The European, and I'm being really serious here. Do we all realise the Human Rights Act is actually drafted by Churchill's Attorney General? Not that the Act, sorry, the European Declaration is drafted by Churchill's Attorney General, but it's intended not as a piece of legislation. It was intended as an aspiration for the newly liberated countries of, which have been under the heel of Germany. And the catastrophe has been to turn the wording of that into pseudo-legislation which applies to individual cases. Can I gently remind you, can we all remind ourselves of, for example, the contrast between the First Amendment of the American Constitution, that nothing shall be done to inhibit freedom of speech, with the equivalent and publication with its equivalent in the Human Rights, the Declaration of Human Rights. Can anybody recall what it says? More or less that there shall be freedom of speech subject to morals, public order, about 45 other things, which of course leaves a total coach and horses for judges. This was never intended to be law. And it seems to me that our great problem has been, and this is exactly what Disraeli means when he distinguishes liberal, in other words, a doctrine of universal human rights is liberal reform. It is abstract, it is alien, and it challenges much of the practice of our country and our law, which is why it's contentious. So you've got to admit it's contentious. It's been debated. On the other hand, virtually everything within it derives from English common law, from the proper accumulation of Burkean wisdom and precedent and experiment. And that seems to me to be the right way to do it. One of the few good moments, I thought, of Cameron, and I was rather cross with him at the time, because I felt that, being a gay man who'd actually been quite heavily involved in the alteration of the laws in the early 90s, the way in which he used the invocation and the imposition of gay marriage as the equivalent of a clause 4 moment to rub the noses of the older members of the Conservative Party in it. I thought that was rather disgraceful. But the justification he applied for it was actually rather good. It was to say, whether it's true or not, did Cameron know the difference between truth and false? Anyway, he said that he thought, presumably after experience with Samantha, that the benefits of marriage were so great that everybody should have access to them. Now, that's a good conservative way of approaching it. Not to invoke a general doctrine that everybody's got a right to do it, but to say, experimentally, historically, it's beneficial. Shouldn't everyone have the right? And I think that in area after area, we have made this profound error of liberal reform. Again, the whole creation of the Supreme Court, the tensions that we've seen as a result of that would not have arisen if there'd simply been the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords. They wouldn't have behaved like that. If you call it a Supreme Court and you give ambitious QCs like panic, they all start to prance up and down as though they were, on Capitol Hill. They Washingtonize themselves. And it's very dangerous. Again, the abolition of the position of Lord Chancellor, which was done purely on grounds of the doctrine of separation of powers. Nobody had ever charged the Lord Chancellor with the political interference in a case or anything like that. And we now know what the consequences were. Do you think that the hollowing out of the judiciary, the failure of the court system, the failure to finance it properly would have happened under a Mackay of Clashfern or under a Derry Irving? Of course it wouldn't. But when you have that kind of series of pseudo-Lord Chancellors, these ridiculous Justice Secretaries, the very name of the Justice Secretary sticks in the craw of an Englishman. And this is all to do with Roman law. It's just not how we do it. And I'm being really, really serious. If you want an illustration of why that liberal reform in accordance with general abstract philosophic principles is so bad, look at the demotion of the position of Lord Chancellor, look at the creation of the Supreme Court, look at the Fixed Term Parliament Act. And again, Disraeli's wisdom in saying, do it in accordance with national principles, the language, and whatever. And for heaven's sake, the richness of English common law offers you this. There was no need to resort to these devices. They're alien.
Hello. Hi, Dr. Starkey. This is Martina from the Daily Express. Hello. So my question is, last week, Nicola Sturgeon did not rule out taking legal action against Boris Johnson if he doesn't allow her to have a second Scottish referendum. But can she constitutionally do so? Because
I'm sorry, I really am not. I'm sure this is elderly deafness. I am not getting this.
Sorry.
Could you speak up?
Yep. Okay.
Or slow down, forgive me. And a clear, precise question would help.
Nicola Sturgeon last week did not rule out taking legal action against Boris Johnson if he gets re-elected and doesn't allow her to have a second Scottish referendum. But can she constitutionally take legal action against him when having a second referendum is a reserved matter for Westminster, not Scotland? And does she have any chances winning a legal action against him?
Who was it? Was it Gina Miller or who was it? Pardon? Nicola Sturgeon. She could try it. Did everybody get the question? She could try it, but it seems to me that if you have if you have got a government with a clear majority, the judges will pull back. That if you have a government without a clear majority, and we're in, the kind of hung parliament situation that we were before the election, you will get more and more intervention from the Supreme Court. And can I just say that the area where I think the intervention of the Supreme Court will be spectacular will be if we have a minority Labour government. If you look at the proposals of the Labour Party, virtually every one of them drives a coach and horse through European legislation. We will see the entire political process stymied. And we will have to decide. As I said, I think that that unless we get a clear Tory majority in this Parliament, we will have to face the fact that our Constitution has reverted to something like the American model, and we will have to go for a directly elected Prime Minister. Otherwise, we will have government that is permanently in stasis.
Justin Shosher from the Bruges Group. Quick question about the House of Lords. Nigel Farage called for its abolition yesterday. Should it be abolished or should it be reformed? And we've had all these bodged reforms over the last few decades. How should it be reformed, if so?
It's a difficult one. I certainly think that the nominated House is utterly without justification. It represents nothing. Again, I think that, in general, a second chamber is a good idea. The debate, the thing we should all look, I've been sort of banging on about Disraeli. The other great source of political wisdom, of course, are the debates of the Founding Fathers, and particularly the Federalist Papers, which I think are the most sophisticated human discourses on the nature of power and how to shape its structure, which have probably ever been produced. They're astonishing, and they benefit from brevity. They're quite amazing. But I think one would have to ask, what might be the purpose of a House of Lords, and what, again, following Disraeli, would it derive from? I mean, if you think of the old House of Lords, it was essentially an assembly of territorial magnates. And when the Americans came to create their chamber, when they came to create the Senate, which, remember, originally was not directly elected, the Senate was nominated by each state assembly. It is only directly elected by constitutional amendment after the First World War. But what the Congress was is territorial representatives, the Senate's 2 senators for each state. And of course, it also then fulfills something else, which was a counterbalance to the mere number of population which is represented, which is there by the House of Representatives. So you get 2 counterbalancing principles. A neo-aristocratic landed principle as against a democratic numerical principle. Now, you could see something like that operating if our parliament were only an English parliament. In other words, you could have 2 senators for each county, or something like that. Another way you could see it working, and there's a desperate need for this, is as a federal chamber. However, we have this profound problem, and again, it's really very important we realise this. The trouble is, history is so badly taught. You know, the Scott Nat's position, of course, is all about Scotland having been wickedly colonised by England and whatever. There is no greater rubbish than this. Scotland comes into union in 1707 because it was bankrupt. It had bankrupted itself in the Darien scheme, and also the elites of both countries wanted union to preserve Protestantism and, above all, to protect the Scots against the Highlanders. You know, the whole business of the kilt is a deep irony. It was hated by the good, dour Presbyterian lowlanders in the early 18th century. And they also wanted to make sure that the Highlands were not a back door to France to invade. And the Scots, above all, wanted access to empire. But in 1707, apart from the fusion of parliaments, Scotland is left with every appurtenance of nationhood. You leave it with its own universities, its own church. The Queen changes religion as she goes north of the border. You leave it with currency issuing. You leave it with its own system of law. You leave it with its own system of heraldry. You leave it with its own court, which is why it would be an act of a stroke of a pen to restore Scottish sovereignty. So what we do in England, in Britain, we never have, again, the French Revolution. The French Revolution, and later on Germany under Bismarck, embark on a program of deliberately using national education to homogenize France and Germany. We have deliberately done the opposite. Deliberately done the opposite. From the 18th century onwards, we started giving, every member of the royal family was given a title which was English, Scottish and Irish. And then in the 20th century, you add Welsh. We create separate orders of chivalry, the Garter, the Patrick for Ireland, and the St Andrews for the Order of St Andrew for Scotland, and so on and so on. And then, with the 19th century and the beginning of romantic nationalism, the Celtic nations all assume standard European-style nationalism, folk music, dress, patron saint, whatever. And with England, it's completely separate and odd because we don't have national dress. Have you noticed? And we don't have the peculiarity of language because ours is a universal language. We don't have a folk, thank God, folk poet. All those strange creatures at the Eisteddfod and the Even Street, and the appalling Burns. God, has there ever been a more tedious poet? We don't have that, but they do. We've got a great nation nationalism, which is why, of course, the loss of empire is so catastrophic to that English sense of identity. But it's because, so we're an utterly unmanageable confederation. Because again, you've got one unit which is hugely bigger than everybody else. And we've only got 4 of them. America, you can have 2 hugely big states, 2 or 3 hugely big states, but because you've got a plethora of others, so the thing can balance out. Trying to federalize the British Constitution would depend on breaking up England, which is exactly what the EU tried to do, and the whole movement of the times is now going in radically the opposite direction. So I would suspect that union is probably unviable. I mean, I would regret it. As a northern Englishman, I would deeply regret it. But I cannot see how the thrust of electoral developments and likely constitutional developments can be squared. You're allowed to.
Before we go here, before we leave the hereditary principle of the House of Lords, I can't remember a time in 50 years or whatever when the monarchy has been so dragged into something such as it was with Brexit. At one point it was being mentioned every day. How, as an historian of the monarchy, how do you think it has emerged from Brexit? What has the effect been on the monarchy of Brexit?
I'm not sure it's been terribly severe. I mean, my real problem is that the monarchy now has no political function. I mean, what was exposed by that was the whole notion of the Queen as constitutional referee, which I was brought up believing, is a nonsense. It's complete nonsense. And what is remarkable is that the British monarchy is uniquely impotent. If you look at the other European monarchies, they all have a very important role in everyday political management. The bargaining in Spain that's going on at the moment is being conducted by King Philip. There's a wonderful, I know slightly, the Queen of the Netherlands, and not the Netherlands, of Denmark. And we were rather drunk one evening, and she smoking away, and I summoned up courage to ask her, what did she most enjoy about being Queen? And she said, carpentry. And she's brilliant English. And of course, I was completely fooled because she does decoupage, she designs ballet and all the rest. So I solemnly said, oh, do you use Black & Decker, And she sort of looked at me with withering contempt. No, I mean making and breaking cabinets. I mean, Wonderful. And that's what George V did. I mean, the formation of the national government, he plays a direct role in that. Jane Ridley is doing what I'm sure will be a wonderful biography, in which he's looking at the role of his private secretary, particularly Lord Stamfordham. There's only one real private secretary of Stamfordham, John Bigg, Lord Stamfordham. And Stamfordham had got contacts with absolutely everybody. He knew everything that was going on. The Queen has never had a long-serving private secretary. There's been nobody who has established that kind of authority. And you know, she ran scared after the business of the succession to Macmillan and so on. And I think that all this dutiful reading of red boxes and whatever, frankly, is, to be blunt, a waste of her time and ours. That we desperately need. I mean, as the last 2.5 years showed, if you don't have a majority government, you have to have a political referee. And you know, Berco's partisanship completely excluded him from that role. We had nobody. And I think it's profoundly dangerous when the monarchy simply becomes, you know, a kind of historical echo. And what's he called? Oh God, the name's gone completely out of my head, argues very powerfully that a monarchy is the only form of proper conservative government, in the sense that, of course, it gives you that unconditional sense that government is, you know, the headship of the state is not something you choose, that it's a datum, that it's a historically that it's a historically constructed thing, and you can make that argument. But dear me, I think it's a little philosophical for everyday life. So I worry deeply. By the way, I don't think the whole business of Prince Andrew matters two hoots. I think the business of Prince Andrew matters two hoots. Two hoots.
Why?
Oh, because I don't think Prince Andrew matters two hoots. But, and also, remember, the monarchy is unbelievably ruthless. The speed with which he was dumped. You know, if you consider how politicians hang on, he hung on for about 2.5 minutes. and you know, and first mummy and then elder brother, you know, sort of turned up and said, bugger off. Didn't they? I mean, it was done with total ruthlessness.
Two gentlemen here, actually.
Yeah.
Yes,
Hi, my name is Guy Sainty, and I actually live half the time in Washington. And there we have a chamber with two political parties, which, however, heavily divided. We have separation of the powers, and we have a constitution that really didn't work terribly well in the last election. Some of what you said suggests that you would like to have a written constitution of some kind in order to reform the role of the Prime Minister, having directly elected, have the House of Lords. And yet, isn't that a very dangerous position when we see something of a disaster in Washington today?
But there may be a disaster in Washington, but it is doing exactly what the Founding Fathers intended it to do. It's stopping Trump doing anything. And the American structure of government is remarkably good at stopping anybody doing anything. It's an immensely elaborate and expensive way of stopping anything ever happening, which is why, you know, you have to rely on the Supreme Court to legislate abortion and whatever. You can't do it politically. I did not suggest making the role of the Prime Minister directly elected as a preference. What I was saying is, if we move into a situation where we multiply political parties and political parties cease regularly to command majorities, the only way we could make our system of government to work would be that. Otherwise, we're Italy. So, in other words, there are objective reasons why systems of government do not work. That if you are in a position where you cannot generate a clear majority, parliamentary government fails. This is why it's so frequently abolished. This is why the parliamentary government of the Fourth Republic is abolished by de Gaulle. This is why all the great assemblies of the Middle Ages, apart from the British Parliament, are abolished. You know, you had the notion that we were peculiar in having a parliament is it's a myth. Every major state of Europe, and virtually all the minor ones, had assemblies, but they got in the way. And in the name of progressive government in the 17th century, they were abolished. And again, many of them displayed the same kind of absurd vanity as the commons led by Berko. You know, in Poland, the Diet had a liberum veto. Everybody had agreed to everything. Nothing ever got done. In the Netherlands, the States General in some ways was even more absurd, that they did not command plenary powers. So every decision had to be referred back to every constituent assembly. So again, it was incapable of doing anything. The British Parliament, which is really the English Parliament, is extraordinarily peculiar in that it develops a way of being managed. And it's a way of being managed which also, again, by this, let's all be boastful, English genius, manages to combine effective government with serious considerations for a democratic mandate. And it's the balance that is achieved in the 1870s and 1880s is very, very remarkable. You take an assembly which had arrogated power to itself and so on, and you make it more or less answerable to a mass electorate. But it depends on the ability, as Disraeli keeps saying, you've got to have two parties, you can't have more than two, and you've got to produce clear majorities. And if you don't, it fails.
Okay, we just have two more questions actually. So we had the gentleman here, and then there was one right, that's right, this gentleman here. Sorry, because we're running out of time. This one here. This one here? And then. Thank you.
Yes. Dr. Starkey, thank you for a thought-provoking lecture. You mentioned in your talk, and again just now, that Parliament can only work with two parties. That would seem to leave us at the mercy of prime ministers that are determined not to do what the public want. I'm thinking most recently of Tony Blair and the Iraq War. Can you suggest any way to address that problem?
No, to be honest. Quite seriously, if a prime minister commands a serious majority in the House, which will vote for him, the only way to deal with it is to remove him from office in the fullness of time. But I mean, the idea that we have some sort of external power doing this, a Supreme Court or whatever, I think is catastrophic. I mean, the current sense of voting not mattering, of areas that feel that they don't participate, that is exactly the processes of alienation. The behavior of the Supreme Court, it seems to me, is to be one, until recently, is one of the essential elements in the rise of Trump's support. And again, we see this here now, the sort of seamless web of Brenda Hale, of Panic, of the Department of Jurisprudence in the University of Oxford, and Gray's Inn. You see the whole kind of elite combination. And no government is perfect. No system of government is perfect. We have to face deep human imperfection. We have to face the fact that politics is about vanity, that it's about ambition, that it is frequently sordid. But until we come up with a better way of doing it, and we've been trying this game for thousands of years, and it seemed to me that the structures that we had developed before the crisis of the early 2000s were, as Churchill says constantly, they weren't terribly good, but they were better than anything else. And I think sorry, again, I'm being really serious here. We're so used to things being perfect. We are so used, because we live in this extraordinary world in which we can control the world with the flick of a switch, to use a very primitive term. That's technology. Human beings are not technology. We are messy, imperfect, confused creatures. And all you can do is gently nudge us towards something better. And all attempts at radical reform, history is absolutely clear, they are catastrophic. Starkey's iron rule of revolutions is they invariably reproduce tenfold the worst features of the previous regime.
I live in Japan, and Japan is an island nation like Britain. It has a monarchy, it even had an English parliament, and it's very conservative, and it has a strong national identity. Do you think it's possible for the UK to have a strong national identity, given that we are built up of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, where Japan is pretty much Japan? Thank you.
Well, indeed, I mean, this is the great problem. When Disraeli talks about the Tory, I mean, Disraeli actually uses the phrase, the Tory party is nothing if it's not a national party. What did he mean? He meant an English party. And we've fallen over backwards in the 20th century, as it were, recognising the Celtic fringe. And I think it's become a rather bad case of three tails wagging the dog. Kind of, Cerberus. Imagine Cerberus with three tails, and I fear. And again, the only way in which I come from the north, my family comes from Oldham, Rochdale, these nightmare places. The only way that we're going to sort it out is by some sort of sense of the possibility of England coming together. I mean, I think the thing that brought it home to me, which was the absolute antithesis of what I thought should happen, was another Hisboo figure, Matthew Paris. Matthew Paris's essay on Clacton-on-Sea. Its contempt, its sneer, its sense that the Tories have got to go along with Richmond and not with Clacton-on-Sea. That is a recipe for genuine political split, for vociferousness, and frankly, for the really serious rise of extremism. The only way that 20th century Britain avoided in going the directions of Europe, and again, it's the answer to your point here, was two broad-based parties that managed to incorporate the weirdest elements in society, sort of, knocking along within them. And it seems to me that the basis of the two parties is changing before our eyes. That the Labour Party is almost certainly going to emerge from this as the 19th century Liberal Party, though with this rather mad economics, but presumably they'll get rid of that pretty quickly. You have touched an essential point, and I made it here before. I think that our decision to have the as it were, multi-nation approach worked, providing they could all lose themselves in empire. The key to it was when the four nations could lose themselves equally in empire. But when we find ourselves thrown back on ourselves, I don't think it works.
And at that point, thank you very, very much.
Rather depressing, therefore. Sorry.
Thank you very much indeed, David, and also for probably the most comprehensively answered questions that I've ever heard in an audience. Thank you very, very much for that. Only really it's up to me now to say thank you very much for coming out. Don't forget to vote.
Don't forget to vote the right way.
And also, more importantly, actually, it's a little bit early, but a very happy Christmas to you. All right, so thank you very much. Thank you.